The weight of trust. Chapter 1, the breaking point. The champagne flute shattered against the marble floor of the penthouse kitchen, sending crystal fragments dancing across the pristine surface. Like fallen stars, Margaret Jones stood frozen, her weathered hands trembling as she stared at the mess, a perfect metaphor for what her life had become in the span of a single phone call. "Grandmother is being dramatic again," came the voice from the hallway, casual and dismissive. Her grandson Derek, 24 and perpetually entitled, was speaking to someone on his phone, apparently unaware that she could hear every word. "She'll get over it. She always does when we need money for something important." Margaret's 72-year-old heart hammered against her ribs, like a caged bird. 3 hours ago, she had called Derek to wish him luck on his medical school entrance exam, the exam she had been funding his preparation for over the past 2 years. Instead of her grandson's voice, she had been greeted by a woman's laughter. And Derek's slurred words, "Grandma who? Oh, right, the ATM. Tell her I'm busy celebrating my acceptance to law school." Wait, was it law school or business school this week? The acceptance letter that had never existed. The medical school applications that were never submitted. The $180,000 she had transferred over 24 months for tuition, books, and living expenses. While Derek supposedly pursued his medical degree in Boston, money that had instead funded a lifestyle of expensive cars, designer clothes, and what appeared to be a steady stream of parties. Margaret sank into the leather chair that had been her late husband's favorite spot, overlooking the Seattle waterfront through floor-to-ceiling windows. Richard had built Jones Industries from a single food truck to a restaurant empire, spanning 3 states before his death 5 years ago. He had always warned her about being too generous, too trusting. "Maggie," he would say in his gentle way, "love doesn't require you to empty your pockets. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do is say no." But she had never learned to say no. Not to their son David when he declared bankruptcy twice before age 30. Not to David's wife Lydia, who had a gift for finding investment opportunities that mysteriously required immediate cash infusions. And certainly not to Derek and his twin sister Elena, who had learned from their parents that grandmother Margaret was an inexhaustible source of financial rescue. The intercom buzzed, interrupting her spiral of regret. "Mrs. Jones," came the voice of Marcus, the building's concierge. "Your granddaughter Elena is here to see you. Should I send her up?" Margaret closed her eyes. Elena, the supposed art student in Portland, who had been receiving monthly allowances for supplies and studio rent, Elena, who had called just last week asking for an additional $15,000 for a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to showcase her work in a gallery. "Send her up," Margaret said quietly. 10 minutes later, Elena Jones burst through the front door with the dramatic flair that had always been her trademark. At 24, she was strikingly beautiful, her grandmother's cheekbones, her grandfather's intelligent eyes, and an aura of creative intensity that had always made Margaret's heart swell with pride. Today, however, Elena looked different. Expensive designer boots clicked across the hardwood floor, and her supposedly starving artist aesthetic had been replaced by clothing that Margaret estimated cost more than most people made in a month. "Grandma Maggie!" Elena rushed forward with arms outstretched, her usual nickname, delivered with theatrical warmth. "I have the most incredible news about my art career." Margaret remained seated, studying her granddaughter's face. "I'm sure you do. But first, tell me about Derek's medical school acceptance. I assume you've heard?" Elena's performance faltered for just a moment, a brief flicker of uncertainty that confirmed Margaret's worst suspicions. "Oh, that... Yes, isn't it wonderful? He's worked so hard." "Which medical school accepted him, Elena?" The young woman's laugh sounded forced. "You know Derek, always humble about his achievements. He said he wanted to tell you himself about the details." Elena perched on the edge of the sofa, her entire demeanor radiating nervous energy. "But Grandma, what I came to tell you about is so much more exciting than Derek's boring medical stuff. I've been accepted into an exclusive artist residency in Tuscany. It's incredibly competitive, only 12 artists worldwide were chosen. But there's a deadline for the deposit, and I need to wire the money today or I'll lose the spot." Margaret watched her granddaughter's animated explanation, seeing clearly for the first time the calculation behind the bright eyes, the practiced nature of her enthusiasm. "How much, Elena?" "50,000. I know it sounds like a lot, but this could launch my entire career. Imagine your granddaughter's paintings hanging in galleries. In Rome, Paris, London, the prestige alone would..." "There is no artist residency," Margaret said quietly. Elena's theatrical mask slipped entirely. "What do you mean? Of course there is. I have the acceptance letter right here. Just like Derek has a medical school acceptance letter, the silence that followed was deafening. Elena's mouth opened and closed, but no words emerged. Margaret watched her granddaughter's face cycle through surprise, calculation, and finally a cold hardness that she had never seen before. I don't know what you're implying, Grandma, Elena said slowly, but I'm hurt that you would question my integrity. Haven't I always been honest with you? Margaret stood up, her slight frame somehow commanding the enormous room. Have you? Let's see. In the past 6 months, you've told me you needed money for art supplies, studio rent, framing costs for a show that apparently never happened, materials for a sculpture that doesn't exist, and now this residency. She moved to her desk and pulled out a manila folder. I had my assistant compile every payment I've made to you in the past 2 years, 68 separate transfers, totaling $247,000. Elena's face went pale. Those were all legitimate expenses for an art career that, according to the private investigator I hired this week, consists of exactly 0 finished pieces, 0 gallery submissions, and 0 enrollment in any art program in Portland or anywhere else. The truth hung between them like a toxic cloud. Elena's shoulders sagged, and for a moment, she looked like the lost little girl Margaret remembered from years past. Then the moment passed, and Elena's expression hardened into something ugly and desperate. You hired a private investigator to spy on your own family? Elena's voice rose to a shrill pitch. What kind of grandmother does that? The kind who just discovered that her grandchildren have been systematically defrauding her. For years, Margaret replied evenly. Tell me, Elena, what did you and Derek really do? With nearly $500,000 of my money? Elena stood abruptly, her designer boots clicking sharply against the floor as she paced. You think you're so clever? Don't you, sitting in your ivory tower judging everyone? You have no idea what it's like to be young and struggling, while you hoard millions like some kind of dragon. Struggling? Margaret's voice remained calm, but Elena could see the steel beneath. You've been driving a BMW that costs more than most people's annual salary. Your brother has been living in a luxury apartment in Capitol Hill. Neither of you has worked a day in your lives. Where exactly is the struggle? You don't understand, Elena exploded. Do you know what it's like to have everyone expect you to be grateful all the time? To have to perform happiness and success for your approval? To know that everyone sees us as the Jones fortune grandchildren instead of real people? Margaret felt a stab of pain at her granddaughter's words, but she pushed it aside. So your solution was to lie to me systematically, while taking hundreds of thousands of dollars under false pretenses? Elena's laugh was bitter. False pretenses? You wanted to believe we were successful and talented. We gave you that gift. You were happy thinking Derek was becoming a doctor, and I was becoming an artist. Isn't that worth something? The cruelty in Elena's voice hit Margaret like a physical blow. This was her granddaughter, the little girl, who used to curl up in her lap for stories, who used to paint pictures for the refrigerator, who used to whisper that she loved Grandma Maggie more than anyone in the world. Where are your parents in all this? Margaret asked quietly. Elena's expression shifted again, becoming wary. What do you mean? I mean, do David and Lydia know what you've been doing? Mom and Dad have nothing to do with this, Elena said quickly, too quickly. Margaret moved to another folder on her desk. The investigator found something interesting. Several of the wire transfers you requested were sent to accounts that your mother had previously used for her various business ventures, accounts that Derek also had access to. Elena's face went ashen. That's just coincidence. Is it, or were your parents helping coordinate this elaborate deception? Margaret's voice grew harder. Tell me, Elena, was this a family business? The front door opened before Elena could answer. David Jones walked in without knocking, his expensive suit wrinkled and his usually perfect hair disheveled. At 52, Margaret's son had inherited his father's business acumen, but none of his ethics. Behind him came Lydia, 48, and polished in the way that only came from other people's money. Her platinum blonde hair perfectly styled despite the late hour. Mother, we need to talk, David said without preamble. His eyes flicked to Elena, who looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. I imagine we do, Margaret replied. I was just discussing with Elena how she and Derek have been stealing from me for the past 2 years. Lydia's perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide her flinch. Stealing is such an ugly word, Margaret. The children made some poor choices, but families should stick together. Poor choices? Margaret's composure finally cracked. They've taken nearly $500,000 under false pretenses. Derek isn't in medical school. Elena isn't an artist. Everything they've told me for 2 years has been an elaborate lie designed to defraud me. David loosened his tie and moved to the bar, helping himself to his father's vintage scotch without asking. You're being dramatic, Mother. So the kids embellish their achievements. You have more money than you could spend in 3 lifetimes. What's the real harm? Margaret stared at her son, her only child, the boy she had raised to value honesty and hard work, and saw a stranger. The harm, David, is that they lied to me. That they've been lying to me for years, while taking my money and apparently laughing about it behind my back. Nobody was laughing, Lydia interjected, though her tone suggested otherwise. The children are just finding their way. Elena is very artistic, and Derek has always been interested in medicine. They'll figure things out eventually. With whose money? Margaret asked sharply. With yours, of course, David said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. That's what family money is for. Dad built Jones Industries for his family. We're his family. Margaret felt something fundamental shift inside her. Just a tectonic plate of belief and love finally cracking under too much pressure. Your father built Jones Industries through 70-hour work weeks and 20 years of sacrifice. He earned every dollar. What have any of you earned? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Elena looked at her feet. Lydia examined her manicure. David poured himself another scotch. I've supported all of you for years. Margaret continued, her voice gaining strength. David, I've bailed you out of 2 bankruptcies and funded 3 different business ventures that mysteriously failed. Lydia, I've paid for your shopping habits, your spa treatments, your consulting fees for work that never materializes. And I did it gladly because I thought I was helping families succeed. You were helping? Lydia said defensively. We've all achieved so much with your support. Have you? What exactly have you achieved, Lydia? Besides spending my money? Lydia's face flushed red. I've raised 2 wonderful children and supported my husband's career. Derek and Elena aren't wonderful. They're fraudsters. And what career are you referring to? David hasn't held a real job in 15 years. David slammed his glass down on the bar. A real job? I've been managing investments, developing business opportunities. You've been living off your trust fund and coming to me every time it runs low. Margaret cut him off. When was the last time any of you actually earned money through honest work? The silence that followed was telling. Margaret looked around the room at her family, her son, daughter-in-law, and granddaughter, and realized she was surrounded by strangers who saw her only as a source of funding for their elaborate lives of leisure and deception. Things are going to change, she said quietly. Immediately, Elena's head snapped up. What do you mean? I mean the trust fund distributions stopped today. The credit cards I've been paying for are canceled. The monthly allowances end. All of it. David's face went pale. Mother, you can't be serious. We have expenses, obligations. Then I suggest you find jobs. Real jobs. Like most adults. You're punishing us for the children's mistakes, Lydia protested. That's not fair. Margaret almost laughed at the absurdity. I'm not punishing anyone. I'm simply stopping my participation in this elaborate charade. You're all adults. Support yourselves. Elena burst into tears, the first genuine emotion Margaret had seen from her all evening. Grandma, please. I know we messed up, but we're family. You can't just abandon us. I'm not abandoning you, Margaret said, though her heart was breaking. I'm giving you the opportunity to become the people I always believed you could be. People who work for what they have. People who tell the truth. People who don't see their grandmother as an ATM. David set down his scotch glass with deliberate care. If you do this, Mother, you'll regret it. We won't just disappear quietly. We have legal rights. Legal rights? Margaret raised an eyebrow. To what? To our inheritance. To our share of Dad's estate. To what's rightfully ours. Margaret moved to her desk and pulled out yet another folder. You mean to this will, where your father left everything to me, with the understanding that I would provide for the family, as I saw fit. This will that gives you no legal claim to anything unless I choose to include you? David's face went through several shades of red. Dad wouldn't have wanted his grandchildren to suffer because of a misunderstanding. Misunderstanding? Margaret's voice rose for the first time all evening. Your children committed fraud, systematic, premeditated fraud. And based on your reactions tonight, I'm beginning to suspect they had help from their parents. Be very careful what you're accusing us of, Mother, David said quietly. But there was something threatening in his tone. Margaret looked at her son, really looked at him, and saw something that chilled her to the bone. There was no remorse in his eyes, no shame, no recognition that what his children had done was wrong. There was only anger at being caught and cold calculation about what came next. I want all of you to leave, she said quietly. Now, Grandma, please, Elena started. Now, they filed out without another word, leaving Margaret alone in the penthouse. That had once felt like a home filled with love and laughter. Now it felt like a mausoleum, beautiful, expensive, and utterly empty. Margaret moved to the window and looked out at the Seattle skyline, the lights of the city twinkling like earthbound stars. Somewhere out there were families who worked for their daily bread, who told each other the truth, who knew the difference between love and money. She thought about Richard, about the man who had built an empire from nothing, and who had always insisted that money was just a tool, not a measure of worth. He had seen this coming, hadn't he? In his gentle way, he had tried to warn her about the difference between helping and enabling, between love and indulgence. The champagne glass fragments still sparkled on the kitchen floor, catching the city lights. Margaret walked over and began picking them up, one piece at a time, her 72-year-old hands working carefully to clean up the mess. As she worked, she made a decision that would change everything. Tomorrow she would call her attorney. Tomorrow she would take control of her life and her legacy. Tomorrow she would discover just how far her family would go when the money stopped flowing. But tonight she would mourn the family she thought she had and begin the hard work of figuring out who she was when she wasn't being used. The last piece of crystal went into the trash, and Margaret Jones began the most important chapter of her life. With yours, of course, David said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. That's what family money is for. Dad built Jones Industries for his family. We're his family. Margaret felt something fundamental shift inside her, just a tectonic plate of belief and love, finally cracking under too much pressure. Your father built Jones Industries through 70-hour work weeks and 20 years of sacrifice. He earned every dollar. What have any of you earned? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Elena looked at her feet. Lydia examined her manicure. David poured himself another scotch. I've supported all of you for years. Margaret continued, her voice gaining strength. David, I've bailed you out of 2 bankruptcies and funded 3 different business ventures that mysteriously failed. Lydia, I've paid for your shopping habits, your spa treatments, your consulting fees for work that never materializes. And I did it gladly because I thought I was helping families succeed. You were helping, Lydia said defensively. We've all achieved so much with your support. Have you? What exactly have you achieved, Lydia, besides spending my money? Lydia's face flushed red. I've raised 2 wonderful children and supported my husband's career. Derek and Elena aren't wonderful. They're fraudsters. And what career are you referring to? David hasn't held a real job in 15 years. David slammed his glass down on the bar. A real job? I've been managing investments, developing business opportunities. You've been living off your trust fund and coming to me every time it runs low. Margaret cut him off. When was the last time any of you actually earned money through honest work? The silence that followed was telling. Margaret looked around the room at her family, her son, daughter-in-law, and granddaughter, and realized she was surrounded by strangers who saw her only as a source of funding for their elaborate lives of leisure and deception. Things are going to change, she said quietly. Immediately. Elena's head snapped up. What do you mean? I mean the trust fund distributions stopped today. The credit cards I've been paying for are canceled. The monthly allowances end. All of it. David's face went pale. Mother, you can't be serious. We have expenses, obligations. Then I suggest you find jobs. Real jobs, like most adults. You're punishing us for the children's mistakes, Lydia protested. That's not fair. Margaret almost laughed at the absurdity. I'm not punishing anyone. I'm simply stopping my participation in this elaborate charade. You're all adults. Support yourselves. Elena burst into tears, the first genuine emotion Margaret had seen from her all evening. Grandma, please. I know we messed up, but we're family. You can't just abandon us. I'm not abandoning you, Margaret said, though her heart was breaking. I'm giving you the opportunity to become the people I always believed you could be. People who work for what they have. People who tell the truth. People who don't see their grandmother as an ATM. David set down his scotch glass with deliberate care. If you do this, Mother, you'll regret it. We won't just disappear quietly. We have legal rights. Legal rights? Margaret raised an eyebrow. To what? To our inheritance. To our share of Dad's estate. To what's rightfully ours. Margaret moved to her desk and pulled out yet another folder. You mean to this will where your father left everything to me, with the understanding that I would provide for the family, as I saw fit? This will that gives you no legal claim to anything unless I choose to include you? David's face went through several shades of red. Dad wouldn't have wanted his grandchildren to suffer because of a misunderstanding. Misunderstanding? Margaret's voice rose for the first time all evening. Your children committed fraud. Systematic, premeditated fraud. And based on your reactions tonight, I'm beginning to suspect they had help from their parents. Be very careful what you're accusing us of, Mother, David said quietly. But there was something threatening in his tone. Margaret looked at her son, really looked at him, and saw something that chilled her to the bone. There was no remorse in his eyes, no shame, no recognition that what his children had done was wrong. There was only anger at being caught and cold calculation about what came next. I want all of you to leave, she said quietly. Now, Grandma, please, Elena started. Now. They filed out without another word, leaving Margaret alone in the penthouse. That had once felt like a home filled with love and laughter. Now it felt like a mausoleum, beautiful, expensive, and utterly empty. Margaret moved to the window and looked out at the Seattle skyline, the lights of the city twinkling like earthbound stars. Somewhere out there were families who worked for their daily bread, who told each other the truth, who knew the difference between love and money. She thought about Richard, about the man who had built an empire from nothing, and who had always insisted that money was just a tool, not a measure of worth. He had seen this coming, hadn't he? In his gentle way, he had tried to warn her about the difference between helping and enabling, between love and indulgence. The champagne glass fragments still sparkled on the kitchen floor, catching the city lights. Margaret walked over and began picking them up one piece at a time, her 72-year-old hands, working carefully to clean up the mess. As she worked, she made a decision that would change everything. Tomorrow she would call her attorney. Tomorrow she would take control of her life and her legacy. Tomorrow she would discover just how far her family would go when the money stopped flowing. But tonight she would mourn the family she thought she had and begin the hard work of figuring out who she was when she wasn't being used. The last piece of crystal went into the trash, and Margaret Jones began the most important chapter of her life. Margaret woke at dawn despite having slept barely 3 hours. The events of the previous evening played in her mind like scenes from a nightmare. But the empty champagne bottle on her kitchen counter and the small bandage on her thumb from cleaning up glass confirmed that it had all been terrifyingly real. She made coffee with hands that only trembled slightly and settled into Richard's chair with her laptop and phone. If her family thought they could wait out her anger, they were about to be unpleasantly surprised. Margaret had spent 40 years as Richard's business partner before his death. She hadn't just been a decorative wife. She knew how to research, how to investigate, and how to follow money trails. Her first call was to James Morrison, the private investigator who had uncovered Derek and Elena's deceptions. At 7 a.m., his phone went straight to voicemail, but he called back within 10 minutes. Mrs. Jones, I wasn't expecting to hear from you so soon. Did you confront them? I did. And you were right about everything. But James, I think this goes deeper than we initially suspected. I need you to expand your investigation. What are you thinking? Margaret pulled up her banking records on her laptop. I want you to trace every payment I've made to any member of my family over the past 5 years. Not just Derek and Elena, David and Lydia too. I want to know where the money actually went, what it was used for, and who else might be involved. That's going to be a significant undertaking, Mrs. Jones. We're probably talking about hundreds of transactions. Money is not a concern. I want the truth, all of it, regardless of cost. There was a pause on the line. Can I ask what happened last night that changed your mind about the scope? Margaret thought about David's threatening tone, about Lydia's complete lack of remorse, about Elena's cold calculation. I realized I've been treating the symptoms instead of diagnosing the disease. My grandchildren didn't learn to be professional liars and thieves in a vacuum. I'll start immediately. This will take several weeks to complete thoroughly. Take whatever time you need. But James, be discreet. I have a feeling that when they realize the money is really stopped, things might get ugly. Her second call was to Patricia Williams, her attorney, and one of the few people who had remained consistently honest with her throughout the years of family financial chaos. Margaret, it's barely 7:30. Is everything all right? No, everything is most decidedly not all right. Patricia, I need to see you today. It's urgent. Of course. What's this about? Margaret summarized the previous evening's revelations, while Patricia listened with occasional sharp intakes of breath. Sweet Jesus, Margaret. I'm so sorry. I know how much your grandchildren meant to you. They still mean everything to me. That's why I need to stop, enabling their criminal behavior before it destroys them completely. Margaret's voice caught slightly. Patricia, I need you to help me restructure everything. The trusts, the will, all of it. And I need you to do it in a way that protects any legitimate beneficiaries from the actions of the bad actors. That's definitely possible, but it will be complex. Can you be here at 10? Margaret was at Patricia's downtown law office by 9:45, having spent the intervening hours reviewing financial records and making disturbing discoveries. The numbers were worse than she had initially calculated. Over the past 5 years, she had transferred nearly $1.8 million to various family members' money that had apparently funded everything from luxury cars to gambling debts, to what appeared to be several failed attempts at cryptocurrency speculation. Patricia's office occupied the top floor of one of Seattle's most prestigious law firms, with a view of Elliott Bay that rivaled Margaret's own penthouse vista. Patricia herself was a formidable woman in her 60s, silver-haired, sharp-eyed, and possessed of the kind of legal mind that had made her one of the Pacific Northwest's most feared estate attorneys. "Show me everything," Patricia said, without preamble, gesturing to the stack of financial documents Margaret had brought. For the next 3 hours, they worked through the paper trail of Margaret's generosity. Patricia's expressions grew increasingly grim. As the full scope of the situation became clear, "Margaret, this is significantly worse than simple fraud," Patricia said finally. "Based on what I'm seeing here, there are potential tax implications, questions about money laundering, and several transactions that could constitute wire fraud at the federal level." Margaret felt her stomach drop. "What do you mean?" "Look at this." Patricia pointed to a series of transfers from the previous year. Elena requested $25,000 for art supplies and studio equipment in March. That money was deposited into an account, registered to something called Pacific Northwest Creative Ventures. 3 days later, an identical amount was transferred from that same account to a cryptocurrency exchange. So Elena was using my money to buy cryptocurrency? It gets worse. That cryptocurrency was then transferred to an offshore digital wallet, registered to an entity in the Cayman Islands. From there, the trail goes cold, but Patricia pulled out another document. 6 months later, David's business account received a $20,000 deposit from a Cayman Islands shell corporation. Margaret stared at the papers, trying to process what she was hearing. "Are you saying they were laundering my money through offshore accounts?" "I'm saying it looks like they've created a sophisticated system for moving your money through multiple entities to obscure its ultimate destination. This isn't just theft, Margaret. This is organized financial crime." Margaret sank back in her chair, feeling suddenly older than her 72 years. "I gave Elena that money because she said she needed art supplies. And Derek's medical school expenses?" Patricia pulled up another set of records. "The money you thought was going to tuition and books was actually being funneled through an entity called Advanced Medical Education Services. That company exists only on paper. It has no employees, no physical address, and no legitimate business activities. It's a shell designed to receive and redirect funds. To where? Gambling websites, luxury car payments, and what appears to be several high-end escort services." Margaret felt nauseous. "My grandson has been using my money for prostitutes, among other things." "And Margaret, here's the part that's really going to upset you. The Advanced Medical Education Services entity was created by David. Your son set up the shell company that his own children used to defraud you." The silence in the office was deafening. Margaret stared out at the Seattle skyline, trying to reconcile the man she had raised her only child, her beloved son, with the criminal mastermind that Patricia's evidence suggested he had become. "How long has this been going on?" she asked quietly. "Based on what I can see here, at least 3 years, possibly longer." Patricia's voice was gentle but unflinching. "Margaret, I think your entire family has been treating you as a personal bank for years, but they've gotten sophisticated about hiding it." Margaret's phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at it and felt her blood pressure spike. "It's from Derek," she told Patricia. "Grandma, I'm sorry about the misunderstanding yesterday. I know Elena told you some things that weren't completely accurate. Can we talk? I'm worried about you being alone and upset. Maybe I should come stay with you for a few days to make sure you're okay." Patricia's eyebrows shot up. "He wants to come stay with you? After being caught red-handed in a years-long fraud scheme?" Another message arrived. This one from Elena. "Grandma Maggie, I couldn't sleep last night thinking about how hurt you must be. I know I haven't been completely honest, but I love you so much. Please don't let money come between us. Family is more important than anything. Can we have lunch today and work this out? Margaret showed the messages to Patricia, who read them with increasing alarm. Margaret, these read like someone trying to get close to you. For a specific purpose. Have you changed any passwords or security codes since last night? No, why would I? Margaret stopped, realizing the implication. You think they might try to access my accounts directly? I think they've been systematically defrauding you for years, and you just cut off their primary source of income. People who are willing to commit wire fraud and money laundering aren't going to just accept being cut off quietly. Margaret's phone rang. David's name appeared on the screen. Don't answer it, Patricia advised. Let it go to voicemail. The call went to voicemail, then immediately rang again. And again. He's persistent, Margaret observed. Or desperate. Margaret, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Based on what we've discovered this morning, your family has been operating what amounts to a criminal enterprise using your money. That's not the kind of situation that resolves with a family meeting and apologies. These people are going to fight to protect their scheme. As if to prove Patricia's point, Margaret's phone buzzed with a new message. This time from Lydia. Margaret, I think you may be having some kind of breakdown. David is very worried about your mental state. Maybe we should schedule an appointment with Dr. Harris to make sure you're thinking clearly. We're all here to support you through whatever this is. Margaret stared at the message, feeling a chill run down her spine. Are they suggesting I'm mentally incompetent? Patricia's expression darkened. It sounds like they might be laying the groundwork for a competency challenge. Margaret, if they can convince a court that you're not mentally capable of managing your affairs, they could take control of everything, Margaret finished. The company, the trusts, all of it. Exactly. And given what we now know about their willingness to engage in financial crimes, I don't think we should assume they'd stop at simple, legal maneuvers. Margaret's phone rang again. This time it was Elena. Answer it, Patricia said. But put it on speaker. I want to hear what she says. Margaret answered the call. Hello, Elena. Grandma Maggie. Elena's voice was bright and cheerful, as if the previous evening had never happened. I was just thinking about you and wanted to check in. How are you feeling today? I'm feeling very clear-headed, thank you. That's wonderful. Listen, I know last night was emotionally intense for all of us. Sometimes when we're under stress, we can misinterpret things or react more strongly than we normally would. Elena's tone was carefully modulated, like someone reading from a script. I was thinking it might be good for you to talk to someone professional. You know, just to process everything that's been happening. What kind of professional? Well, Dr. Harrison has been the family psychiatrist for years. He knows you, knows your history. Maybe he could help you sort through these feelings of mistrust and suspicion. Sometimes when people get older, especially after losing a spouse, they can develop paranoid thoughts about the people closest to them. Margaret looked at Patricia, who was taking notes furiously. I see, Margaret said carefully. And what makes you think I'm having paranoid thoughts? Oh, Grandma, last night you were talking about private investigators and fraud. You seemed to think Derek and I were deliberately lying to you, when really, we've just been trying to protect you from worrying about our struggles. Sometimes love makes us tell little white lies to protect the people we care about most. Patricia held up a legal pad with a note scrawled across it. They're trying to gaslight you into thinking your rational response is mental illness. Elena, Margaret said slowly, are you suggesting that discovering you've been systematically lying to me about your education and career while taking hundreds of thousands of dollars under false and pretenses is a paranoid delusion on my part? There was a pause. When Elena spoke again, her voice had lost some of its careful modulation. Grandma, you're putting the worst possible interpretation on everything. We're family. We love you. Sometimes family members go through rough patches and we help each other out. That's what you've been doing, helping us through rough patches. There's nothing criminal or dishonest about that. Even when the help is obtained through false pretenses. What false pretenses? Derek is genuinely interested in medicine. I am genuinely artistic. Just because our paths haven't been completely linear doesn't mean we've been lying to you. Margaret almost admired the audacity. Elena, Derek has never submitted a single medical school application. You haven't created a single piece of art in 2 years. How is that not lying? You're being very rigid in your thinking, Grandma. Life isn't as black and white as you're making it seem. Maybe we should set up that appointment with Dr. Harrison. He could help you understand. Margaret hung up. Patricia looked up from her notes. Margaret, I think they're going to try to have you declared incompetent. That message from Lydia, this call from Elena, they're building a narrative that you're mentally unstable and making irrational decisions based on paranoid delusions. But I have evidence. Documentation. Proof of everything they've done. Evidence they'll claim. You've misinterpreted due to your declining mental faculties. Margaret, you need to understand something. If they can convince a judge that you lack the capacity to manage your affairs, all the evidence in the world won't matter. They'll be appointed as your conservators, and they'll have legal control over every aspect of your life and finances. Margaret felt the room spinning slightly. How is that possible? I'm perfectly competent. You and I know that. But competency challenges don't require proof of actual incompetence. They require proof of the appearance of incompetence. And frankly, a 72-year-old widow who suddenly cuts off her entire family and starts talking about elaborate financial conspiracies could appear unstable to the wrong judge. So what do I do? Patricia was quiet for a moment, thinking. First, we immediately change all your passwords, security codes, and access credentials. Second, we schedule you for a comprehensive neuropsychological evaluation with an independent doctor, someone they can't claim as biased. Third, we begin the process of restructuring your estate and financial arrangements to protect your assets from any potential legal challenges. And fourth, Patricia's smile was grim. Fourth, we gather enough evidence of their criminal activities to make sure that if they do try to challenge your competency, we can bury them in court. Margaret spent the rest of the day in Patricia's office, working with a team of lawyers and forensic accountants to begin unraveling the full scope of her family's financial crimes. By 6 p.m., the picture was even worse than they had initially discovered. The total amount stolen over 5 years was closer to $2.3 million. The money had been laundered through a network of shell companies, offshore accounts, and cryptocurrency exchanges that suggested a level of sophistication far beyond what any of them could have managed alone. Someone with serious financial expertise has been helping them, Patricia concluded. This isn't the work of amateurs. Margaret's phone had been buzzing constantly throughout the day, with calls and messages from David, Lydia, Derek, and Elena. The tone had gradually shifted from concern and love to frustration and barely veiled threats. David's most recent message read, "Mother, you're clearly not thinking straight. We're all worried about your mental state. If you don't start acting rationally, we may have to take steps to protect you from yourself." They're not even pretending anymore, Patricia observed. Margaret looked out at the Seattle skyline as darkness fell over the city. Somewhere out there was the family. She thought she knew the son she had raised, the daughter-in-law. She had welcomed the grandchildren she had loved more than life itself. But the evidence spread across Patricia's conference table told a different story entirely. Patricia, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Of course. Is there any chance I could be wrong about this? Is there any way to interpret this evidence that doesn't make my family into criminals? Patricia looked at the stacks of financial records, the forensic accountant's preliminary reports, the paper trails of lies and deception that stretch back years. No, Margaret. I'm sorry, but no. What we're looking at here is systematic, premeditated financial fraud. This isn't a misunderstanding or a series of poor choices. This is organized crime. Margaret nodded slowly. Then I know what I have to do. What's that? I'm going to protect the people I love from the people they've become, even if it breaks my heart. As Margaret left Patricia's office that evening, her phone rang one more time. This time it was from a number she didn't recognize. Mrs. Jones, this is Dr. Richard Harrison. I'm a psychiatrist, and I believe I've been treating members of your family. Margaret's blood ran cold. I didn't call you, Dr. Harrison. She hung up and immediately called Patricia. They've already contacted a psychiatrist, Margaret said without preamble. Someone named Dr. Harrison. He just called to tell me David wants him to evaluate my mental capacity. Son of a bitch, Patricia muttered. They're moving fast. Margaret, you need to get that independent evaluation scheduled immediately. First thing tomorrow morning. I will. Patricia, one more thing. I want to know who's been helping them with the financial sophistication. This level of money laundering doesn't happen without professional guidance. I'll have our forensic team dig deeper. But Margaret, be careful tonight. If they're desperate enough to try a competency challenge this quickly, there's no telling what else they might attempt. Margaret drove home through the Seattle traffic, her mind racing. As she pulled into the parking garage of her building, she noticed a familiar car in one of the visitor spaces, David's black Mercedes. Her heart rate spiked, but she forced herself to remain calm. Marcus, the concierge, intercepted her at the elevator. Mrs. Jones, your son is waiting upstairs? He said you were expecting him? I wasn't, but thank you for letting me know. The elevator ride to the penthouse felt like an eternity. When the doors opened, Margaret found David sitting in Richard's chair, making himself completely at home. He had helped himself to another scotch and was reviewing papers from her desk. Mother, we need to talk. Margaret set down her purse and coat, moving deliberately slowly to maintain her composure. I see you've made yourself comfortable and helped yourself to my private papers. David held up a bank statement. I'm trying to understand what's gotten into you. You've transferred over $50,000 to law firms in the past 24 hours. That's not normal behavior. Neither is stealing nearly $2.5 million from your mother. Over 5 years, but here we are. David's expression hardened. You're being dramatic. And frankly, Mother, your behavior over the past day has been concerning. Lydia and I think you might be having some kind of episode. Margaret moved to the bar and poured herself a glass of wine, using the time to study her son's face. She was looking for any trace of the boy. She had raised the young man who had once brought her wildflowers and told her she was the best mother in the world. She found none of that person in the cold, calculating stranger sitting in her living room. What kind of episode would explain my discovering that my grandchildren have been systematically defrauding me? With help from their parents? See, there it is again. David stood up, moving closer to her. These paranoid accusations. This black and white thinking. Mother, families are complicated. Money flows back and forth. Sometimes the children need help, and we provide it. That's not fraud, that's family. Even when the help is obtained through elaborate lies about medical school and art careers. David waved his hand dismissively. Derek is young. He's figuring out his path. Elena is creative and artistic. Just because they haven't followed traditional timelines doesn't make them criminals. Margaret sipped her wine and watched her son carefully. David, I've seen the shell companies, the offshore accounts, the cryptocurrency laundering. This isn't young people figuring out their paths. This is organized financial crime. For just a moment, David's mask slipped, and Margaret saw something that chilled her, not surprise or confusion, but anger at being caught. I don't know what you think you've discovered, he said slowly, but I can guarantee you're misinterpreting the evidence. Sometimes when people get older, especially after experiencing grief, they can develop fixed delusions about their loved ones. They start seeing conspiracies where none exist. Who helped you set up the shell companies, David? I have no idea what you're talking about. Margaret walked to her desk and pulled out the Forensic Accountant's Preliminary Report, Advanced Medical Education Services, Pacific Northwest Creative Ventures, 3 other entities that exist only on paper, all created by the same law firm, all using variations of your signature on the incorporation documents. David's face went pale, but his voice remained steady. Mother, you're clearly confused. The same law firm where your college roommate works, Marcus Delano, the one who's been helping you hide assets for years. The silence that followed was deafening. David stared at Margaret with an expression she had never seen before, pure, cold rage barely held in check. You hired investigators to spy on your own family, he said quietly. You're sitting here accusing your son and grandchildren of being criminals because you can't accept that maybe, just maybe, you're not thinking clearly anymore. I'm thinking more clearly than I have in years. David moved closer, and for the first time in her life, Margaret felt afraid of her own son. Mother, I've scheduled an appointment with Dr. Harrison for tomorrow morning. He's going to conduct a comprehensive evaluation of your mental state. I'm not going. Yes, you are. Because if you don't, I'll file for an emergency conservatorship hearing. I'll present evidence of your erratic behavior, your paranoid accusations, your sudden irrational financial decisions. I'll show the court that you're no longer capable of managing your affairs. Margaret set down her wine glass with a steady hand. And then what, David? You become my conservator? You gain control of Jones Industries, the trust funds, all of it? I become responsible for protecting you from yourself, just like Dad would have wanted. The mention of Richard was like a slap across the face. Your father would be horrified by what you've become. David's composure finally cracked completely. My father built an empire and then left it all to you instead of to his own son. Do you have any idea what that felt like? To spend 30 years working in his shadow, only to discover that he didn't trust me enough to inherit what should have been mine? Margaret stared at her son, finally understanding the source of years of resentment she had never fully grasped. Your father left everything to me because he knew I would take care of the family. He trusted me to do the right thing. The right thing? You mean like hoarding millions? While his son struggles to maintain a decent standard of living? Struggles? Margaret's voice rose. David, you haven't worked a real job in 15 years. I've given you hundreds of thousands of dollars. How is that struggling? It's not enough, David exploded. Do you know what it's like to be David Jones, son of Richard Jones, and have to ask my mother for permission every time I want to make a major purchase? To have to justify every expense, every investment, every business opportunity? Margaret felt pieces clicking into place. So you decided to take what you felt you deserved. Through your children. I decided to stop being dependent on your grudging charity. The kids needed money for their education and careers. I helped them access funds that should have been flowing to the family anyway, by creating a criminal conspiracy to defraud me. David straightened his tie and moved toward the door. Tomorrow morning, 9 a.m., Dr. Harrison's office. If you're not there, I file the conservatorship petition that afternoon. David, wait. He paused at the door. I need you to understand something, Margaret said quietly. I loved you more than life itself. I would have given you anything you asked for honestly. If you had come to me and said you needed money, or wanted a larger role in the business, or felt like your inheritance was inadequate, I would have listened. We could have worked something out. David's hand was on the doorknob, but he didn't turn around. Instead, you chose to steal from me, to teach your children to steal from me, to turn the people I love most in the world into criminals. Margaret's voice broke slightly. How am I supposed to forgive that? David turned around slowly, and for a moment, Margaret thought she saw a flicker of the sun she remembered. Then his expression hardened again. You're supposed to understand that family's more important than money. And if you can't understand that, then maybe you really do need professional help. He left without another word, leaving Margaret alone in the penthouse that no longer felt like home. She poured herself another glass of wine and sat in Richard's chair, looking out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, her family was planning their next move. They would try to have her declared incompetent. They would fight for control of everything Richard had built. They would probably succeed in destroying the family name and the business empire that had taken decades to create. But Margaret had spent 40 years learning from one of the shrewdest businessmen in the Pacific Northwest. She had resources, connections, and most importantly, she had the truth on her side. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Mrs. Jones, this is Dr. Sarah Martinez from Seattle Neuropsychological Associates. Ms. Williams asked me to contact you about scheduling an emergency consultation. I can see you tomorrow morning at 7 a.m. if that works. We need to get this done before anyone else can question your mental capacity. Margaret typed back, I'll be there. Then she called James Morrison, the private investigator. Mrs. Jones, it's late. Is everything all right? No, it's not. They're moving faster than we anticipated. James, I need you to dig deeper into Marcus Delano, David's college roommate. I think he's the one who's been providing the legal expertise for their money laundering operation. I'll start tonight. What else do you need? Margaret looked around the penthouse at the art Richard had collected, at the photographs of happier times, at the life they had built together. Brick by brick through honest work and genuine love. I need you to help me save my family from themselves, even if they hate me for it. Margaret didn't hesitate. I'm listening. Marcus Delano's voice was smooth, cultured, and completely without warmth. I understand you've been conducting some amateur detective work regarding your family's financial arrangements. Is that what you call systematic fraud and money laundering, financial arrangements? There was a soft chuckle on the line. Mrs. Jones, you're operating under some significant misunderstandings. Your family came to me for help managing some complex financial situations. I provided that help using perfectly legal financial instruments. Shell companies and offshore accounts used to launder money for organized crime. Figures are not perfectly legal financial instruments. The silence on the line stretched for several seconds. I think you've been getting bad advice from your lawyers, Mrs. Jones. Sometimes when people are grieving or experiencing age-related cognitive changes, they can misinterpret perfectly innocent business activities as something sinister. Margaret recognized the same gaslighting strategy her family had been using. But coming from Marcus, it felt far more dangerous. Mr. Delano, I have forensic accountants and federal investigators examining your work. The money laundering is documented, the shell companies are exposed, and the criminal connections are being traced as we speak. Mrs. Jones, Marcus's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. I think you should be very careful about making accusations you can't prove, and even more careful about interfering with business relationships that you don't understand. Is that a threat? It's friendly advice. Your grandchildren are lovely young people who got caught up in situations beyond their comprehension. It would be tragic if their grandmother's misguided investigation put them in harm's way. Margaret's blood ran cold. What are you saying? I'm saying that sometimes the safest thing for everyone involved is to let sleeping dogs lie. Stop the investigation, dismiss your lawyers, and go back to being a generous grandmother who supports her family without asking too many questions. Everyone wins that way. And if I don't? Marcus Delano's laugh was like ice cracking. Mrs. Jones, I think you should ask yourself how much your grandchildren's safety is worth to you. The line went dead. Margaret stared at her phone, her hands shaking slightly. She was no longer dealing with just family dysfunction or even simple fraud. She was dealing with someone who had just implied that her grandchildren would be hurt if she didn't back down. But backing down meant letting Marcus continue his criminal operation. It meant letting Derek and Elena remain trapped in a web of crime that would eventually destroy them. And it meant giving up on the possibility of justice. For the years of lies and betrayal, Margaret thought about Richard, about the man who had never backed down from a fight when he knew he was right. She thought about the business empire he had built through honest work and principled decisions. She thought about the legacy he had left her to protect. Then she thought about Derek and Elena, scared and potentially in danger, because of choices they had made as young adults, who thought they were just getting easy money from their grandmother. Margaret made her decision. She was going to the Space Needle. Dr. Sarah Martinez's office was a study in calming, neutrality, soft blues and grays, natural lighting, and an absence of the clinical sterility that Margaret had expected. At 60-something, Dr. Martinez possessed the kind of quiet authority that came from decades of evaluating minds under pressure. She had agreed to see Margaret at 7 a.m., a full 2 hours before David's appointed psychiatrist would expect to begin his evaluation. Mrs. Jones, I've reviewed the materials that Miss Williams sent over last night. I want you to know that this evaluation will be comprehensive and completely independent. No one has influenced my approach, and no one will influence my conclusions. Margaret settled into the comfortable chair across from the doctor's desk. What exactly does a neuropsychological evaluation involve? We'll test cognitive function, memory, decision-making capacity, and emotional stability. The entire process takes about 4 hours. By the end, I'll be able to provide a definitive assessment of your mental competency that will hold up in any legal proceeding. For the next 4 hours, Margaret's mind was put through its paces. Memory tests, logical reasoning, problem-solving exercises, and detailed interviews about her recent decisions and thought processes. Dr. Martinez was thorough but kind, never making Margaret feel like she was being judged or found wanting. Mrs. Jones, Dr. Martinez said as they concluded the final segment, based on everything I've observed today, your cognitive function is not only normal for your age, it's exceptional. Your memory is sharp, your reasoning is clear, and your decision-making process is logical and well-considered. If someone is questioning your mental capacity, they're either misinformed or they have ulterior motives. Margaret felt a wave of relief so powerful it nearly brought her to tears. So if someone tries to claim I'm incompetent, I'll testify that any such claim is medically baseless. You're one of the most mentally acute 72-year-olds I've ever evaluated. Margaret left Dr. Martinez's office feeling like she had just won the first battle in what was shaping up to be a war. Her phone showed 17 missed calls from David and a series of increasingly angry text messages, demanding to know where she was. The last message, sent just 10 minutes earlier, was chilling in its simplicity. Mother, you've made a serious mistake. I hope you're prepared for the consequences. Margaret drove straight to Patricia's office, where she found a scene of controlled chaos. The conference room was filled with forensic accountants, computer specialists, and investigators, all working to untangle the web of financial crimes that her family had been operating for years. Margaret, thank God, Patricia said as she entered. We've made some significant discoveries overnight. James Morrison looked up from a laptop covered in financial spreadsheets. Mrs. Jones, you were right about Marcus Delano. He's not just helping them hide money, he's been orchestrating the entire operation. Patricia gestured to a wall, covered with financial flowcharts and legal documents. Margaret, what we've uncovered is bigger than simple fraud. Marcus Delano has been using your family as a front for a sophisticated money laundering operation that extends far beyond your personal finances. Margaret studied the charts, trying to follow the lines and arrows that connected various accounts and entities. I don't understand. What do you mean? James pulled up a series of bank records on his laptop. The shell companies that your family created weren't just for hiding the money they took from you. They've been moving money for other men to eternity. Clients, people who needed to hide assets from divorce proceedings, business partners, even some individuals who appear to be connected to organized crime. You're saying my son and grandchildren are involved with criminals? We're saying Marcus Delano is involved with criminals, and he's been using your family's financial network to facilitate their activities. The money you thought was being stolen for Derek's gambling and Elena's shopping was actually being mixed with much larger sums from much more dangerous sources. Patricia sat down heavily. Margaret, this changes everything. We're not just dealing with family financial fraud anymore. We're potentially dealing with RICO violations, money laundering for organized crime, and federal charges that could put your family members in prison for decades. Margaret felt the room spinning. How is that possible? They're just selfish and irresponsible. They're not criminal masterminds. They're not masterminds, James agreed. They're useful idiots. Marcus Delano identified a wealthy family with internal dysfunction and exploited it. He convinced David that he was helping him access his rightful inheritance, convinced the kids that they were just being creative about funding their lifestyles, and used all of them as a front for moving much larger amounts of dirty money. Patricia pulled out another set of documents. Margaret, in the past 6 months alone, over $4 million, has moved through the shell companies that bear your family's signatures. Only about $500,000 of that was actually your money. The rest came from sources we're still trying to identify. Margaret sank into a chair, trying to process the magnitude of what she was hearing. So when I cut off their access to my money, you didn't just threaten their lifestyle, Patricia finished. You threatened to expose a multi-million-dollar money laundering operation. That's why they're moving so aggressively to have you declared incompetent. If they can regain control of your finances, they can continue operating their scheme. Margaret's phone buzzed with yet another call from David. This time she answered it and put it on speaker so the room could hear. Mother, where the hell are you? Dr. Harrison has been waiting for you for over an hour. I'm not coming, David. The hell you're not. Mother, I'm trying to help you, but you're making this very difficult. If you don't show up voluntarily, I'm going to have to pursue other options. Patricia leaned toward the phone. David, this is Patricia Williams. You might want to think very carefully about your next steps. There was a pause. Patricia, what are you doing there? I'm helping your mother protect herself from what appears to be a systematic criminal conspiracy involving fraud, money laundering, and potentially RICO violations. The silence on the line stretched for nearly 30 seconds. I have no idea what you're talking about, David said finally, but his voice had lost its confident edge. Patricia consulted her notes. Advanced Medical Education Services, Pacific Northwest Creative Ventures, and Cascade Investment Holdings. Do those names ring any bells, David? Another long pause. Those are legitimate business entities. Entities that exist only on paper, that have been used to launder over $4 million in the past 6 months, and that were created by Marcus Delano, using forged signatures that our handwriting experts are prepared to testify were not actually signed by the people whose names appear on the documents. Margaret heard what sounded like something breaking in the background of David's call. You don't know what you're dealing with, David said quietly. This is bigger than you understand. You need to back off. Is that a threat, David? Patricia asked. It's a warning. Mother, for your own safety, you need to stop this investigation and come to Dr. Harrison's office. Now, the line went dead. Margaret looked around the room at the team of professionals who had been working to untangle her family's crimes. He just threatened me, didn't he? It sounded like it, James agreed. Mrs. Jones, I think we need to consider your physical safety as well as your financial security. If Marcus Delano is involved with organized crime, and if your family's actions are threatening to expose his operation, Patricia was already reaching for her phone. I'm calling the FBI. This has moved beyond what local law enforcement can handle. The FBI, Margaret felt like she was trapped in a nightmare that kept getting worse. Patricia, these are my grandchildren we're talking about. Derek and Elena are just kids who made bad choices. Margaret, Derek, and Elena may have started as kids making bad choices, but they're now adult participants in a federal crime syndicate. The money laundering alone carries a 20-year sentence. If the FBI can connect them to the organized crime sources of some of these funds. Margaret thought about Elena's bright smile, about Derek's laugh, about the grandchildren who used to curl up in her lap for bedtime stories. Isn't there some way to protect them? To get them out of this? Before it destroys their lives completely? James and Patricia exchanged glances. Maybe, Patricia said carefully. If they're willing to cooperate with federal investigators, if they're willing to testify against Marcus Delano and provide information about the broader money laundering network, if they're willing to admit what they've done and help, authorities shut down the operation. And if they're not willing, then they go down with everyone else involved. Margaret's phone rang again. This time it was Elena. Don't answer it, Patricia advised. I have to. She's my granddaughter. Margaret answered the call but didn't put it on speaker. Grandma Maggie, please, you have to listen to me. Elena's voice was shaking, and she sounded genuinely terrified. I don't know what you think you've discovered, but you're in danger. Real danger. You need to stop investigating and come home. Elena, where are you? I can't tell you that. But Grandma, there are people involved in this who aren't like us. People who don't care about family, or love, or any of the things that normal people care about. If you keep digging, they're going to hurt you. Margaret felt ice water in her veins. What people, Elena? Who are you talking about? I can't. Grandma, please, just trust me. Stop the investigation, fire the lawyers and the investigators, and pretend like none of this ever happened. Go back to the way things were before. Elena, listen to me very carefully. Are you safe right now? There was a long pause. I don't know. Where is Derek? I don't know that either. Grandma, I'm scared. For the first time since this nightmare began, Margaret heard her granddaughter's real voice, not the practiced manipulation, not the theatrical performance, but the frightened young woman who had gotten in far over her head. Elena, I want you to come to Patricia Williams' law office. Right now. Don't tell anyone where you're going. Don't stop anywhere. Just come straight here. I can't. They'll know. Who will know? The people who... Grandma, I think Derek and I were just supposed to be the distraction. I think the real crime is much bigger than what we were doing. And now that you found out about it, the line went dead. Margaret immediately tried calling back, but Elena's phone went straight to voicemail. We need to find her, Margaret said, standing up abruptly. And Derek, if they're in danger because of my investigation. Patricia was already on the phone with the FBI. Agent Morrison, this is Patricia Williams. I'm calling about a potential RICO case involving money, laundering, and organized crime. Yes, I'll hold. James was working frantically on his laptop. I'm trying to trace Elena's last known location using cell tower data. It's going to take a few minutes. Margaret paced the conference room, her mind racing. How had a simple discovery of her grandchildren's lives spiraled into a federal crime investigation that might get them killed? Patricia finished her call with the FBI. They're sending agents over immediately. They want to interview you about everything you've discovered, and they want all our financial evidence. What about Elena and Derek? They're going to try to locate them. Margaret, I need you to understand something. If your grandchildren are genuinely in danger from organized crime figures, the best way to protect them is to help. The FBI shut down the entire operation quickly and completely. Margaret's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Mrs. Jones, this is Derek. Don't trust anyone. Elena and I are safe for now, but we need to meet. Alone. No lawyers, no investigators, no FBI. Just family. Seattle Center, Space Needle Observation Deck, 2 p.m. Come alone or we disappear forever. Margaret showed the message to Patricia and James. Absolutely not, Patricia said immediately. This could be a trap. We don't know who's actually sending these messages. It's Derek, Margaret said with certainty. I can tell from the way he writes. Even if it is Derek, this could still be a trap. They could be forcing him to send the message. Margaret looked out the conference room window at the Seattle skyline. In the distance, she could see the Space Needle rising above the city, like a steel prayer reaching toward the sky. Patricia, these are my grandchildren. If they're in danger, if there's any chance I can help them. Margaret, you could be walking into a situation where criminals kill you to prevent you from exposing their operation. Or I could be walking into a situation where I finally have the chance to save the people I love most in the world. James looked up from his laptop. Mrs. Jones, I've traced Elena's last call. It came from a cell tower near the waterfront, down in the industrial district. That's not a residential area, it's mostly warehouses and shipping facilities. Patricia's expression grew even grimmer. Margaret, that's exactly the kind of location where people get hurt. Your grandchildren may have been taken to ensure they can't cooperate with authorities. Margaret thought about Elena's frightened voice, about Derek's cryptic message, about the two children. she had raised from infancy and loved more than her own life. "I'm going to the Space Needle," she said quietly. "Margaret, no. I'm going alone as requested. But I want all of you to be ready to call for help if something goes wrong." "This is insane," Patricia protested. "The FBI will be here in 20 minutes. We can coordinate a proper response. In 20 minutes, Derek and Elena might disappear forever. Or they might be dead." Margaret picked up her purse and coat. "Patricia, I've spent 2 days learning that my family isn't who I thought they were, but underneath all the lies and crimes and manipulation, they're still the children I raised. And I'm not going to abandon them now." As Margaret left Patricia's office, her phone rang one more time. The caller ID showed Marcus Delano's name. She answered without hesitation. "Mrs. Jones, I think it's time we had a conversation." The Space Needle observation deck was nearly empty. At 2 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon, Margaret stood at the eastern windows, looking out over the Seattle skyline toward the Cascade Mountains, their snow-capped peaks gleaming in the late winter sunshine. The city spread below her like a circuit board, all interconnected streets and glittering buildings, beautiful and complex and impossible to understand from this height. She had arrived 20 minutes early, despite Patricia's final, desperate attempt to convince her to wait for FBI backup. The elevator ride to the observation deck had felt like ascending into another world, leaving behind the complications and betrayals at ground level. For a few precious minutes of clarity and perspective. "Grandma," he said, and his voice cracked slightly on the word. Margaret opened her arms and Derek rushed into them like the frightened child. He had never stopped being underneath all the sophisticated criminal behavior. For a moment, she held her grandson and remembered all the times she had comforted him after nightmares, after playground bullies, after the small tragedies that define childhood. "Where is Elena?" Margaret asked when they finally separated. Derek's expression grew guarded. "She's safe. But Grandma, we need to talk, and we don't have much time." "Time before what?" Derek looked around the observation deck, nervously checking to make sure they were truly alone. "Before Marcus realizes I'm here. Before he decides we've become too much of a liability." Margaret guided Derek to a bench near the windows, where they could sit and talk while keeping an eye on the elevator. "Derek, I need you to tell me the truth. All of it. No more lies, no more manipulation. Just the truth." Derek was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the city below. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "It started so small, Grandma. I was struggling in college. Failing classes, spending too much money on stupid things. Dad suggested I talk to his friend Marcus about getting some financial help. That wouldn't have to go through you." "What kind of help?" "Marcus said he could set up some accounts. That would make it easier to access family money without all the paperwork and approval processes. He said wealthy families did it all the time, created educational trusts and creative funding, vehicles that were more flexible than traditional inheritance structures." Margaret felt a chill of recognition. "And you believed him?" "I wanted to believe him. It sounded so reasonable, so sophisticated." "Marcus is brilliant, Grandma. He knows more about finance and law than anyone I've ever met." When he explained how these structures worked, it all made perfect sense. "What about the lies? The fake medical school acceptance? The non-existent art career?" Derek's face flushed with shame. "That was my idea, actually. I was so far behind in school, so far from actually getting into medical school, that I panicked. I thought if I could just buy myself some time, get some money to pay off debts and get back on track, I could eventually make the lies true." "And Elena?" "Elena was struggling too. Art school is expensive, and she wasn't getting the recognition she expected. When I told her about Marcus's financial structures, she wanted in. We thought we were just accelerating our access to money that would eventually be ours anyway." Margaret studied her grandson's face, seeing the genuine remorse, but also recognizing the elaborate self-justification that had allowed him to live with his choices. "Derek, when did you realize it wasn't just family money you were accessing?" Derek's head snapped up and Margaret saw fear flood his eyes. "What do you mean?" "The money laundering, the offshore accounts, the organized crime connections. When did you realize that Marcus was using you and Elena as fronts for much larger criminal activities?" Derek's face went white. "How do you know about that?" "I hired investigators, forensic accountants. The FBI is involved now, Derek. The entire operation is being exposed." Derek stood up abruptly and began pacing, his hands shaking. "Oh God, oh God, oh God. Grandma, you don't understand what you've done. These people don't just steal money, they hurt people who threaten their business." "What people, Derek? Who is Marcus working with?" I don't know names, but I've seen them. Men who come to meetings and don't say much, but everyone is terrified of them. Elena and I started realizing about 6 months ago that the money we were moving was way more than what we were taking from you. Why didn't you come to me then? Derek stopped pacing and looked at her with an expression of profound regret. Because we were in too deep. Because Marcus made it clear that people who tried to leave, his organization didn't just lose money, they lost everything. And because, Derek's voice broke, because we were ashamed. We had turned into exactly the kind of people Dad always said. You spoiled us into becoming. Margaret felt tears threatening for the first time since this nightmare began. Derek, your father was wrong about many things. But mostly I was wrong. I gave you money instead of teaching you to earn it. I solved your problems instead of teaching you to solve them yourselves. I enabled your poor choices because I couldn't bear to see you struggle. You were trying to love us. I was trying to buy your love. And in doing so, I made you vulnerable to someone like Marcus, who could exploit your dependence and your lack of real-world skills. Derek sat back down, his shoulders sagging. What happens now, Grandma? Elena and I are terrified. We want out of this, but we don't know how to get out without getting killed. The FBI wants you to cooperate, to testify against Marcus, and provide information about the money laundering operation. In exchange, they'll protect you and potentially reduce any charges. And if we don't cooperate, Margaret took her grandson's hand. Then you go to prison for 20 years as co-conspirators in a RICO case. Derek closed his eyes. Elena and I talked about this. We know we have to cooperate. But Grandma, these people have resources we can't imagine. Even if the FBI protects us during the investigation, what happens after? Do we spend the rest of our lives looking over our shoulders? The alternative is spending the rest of your lives in prison. Derek, you and Elena made terrible choices, but you're not career criminals. You're young people who got manipulated by someone, much smarter and more dangerous than you understood. The FBI knows the difference. Derek opened his eyes and looked at her with an expression that was both hopeful and terrified. You really think they'll protect us? I think they'll try. But Derek, you have to understand the protection only works if you tell them everything. Every account, every transaction, every person you've met, every conversation you've overheard. If you hold back information to protect your father or Marcus or anyone else, you'll lose any chance of a deal. Derek was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the city. Dad doesn't know about the organized crime stuff, he said finally. He really thought he was just helping us access family money more efficiently. Marcus kept him in the dark about the bigger operation. Are you sure about that? Yeah. Dad's a lot of things, but he's not a criminal mastermind. He's just a guy who never learned how to support himself and was looking for a way to access money he felt entitled to. Marcus used Dad's resentment about the inheritance to recruit him, but Dad doesn't know about the money laundering for outside clients. Margaret felt a small measure of relief. Her son was still a thief and a fraud, but at least he wasn't an active participant in organized crime. What about Lydia? Derek shook his head. Mom doesn't know anything about any of it. She just spends the money and doesn't ask questions about where it comes from. She's completely clueless. Derek, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Have you or Elena ever been physically threatened by Marcus or his associates? Derek's hesitation told her everything she needed to know. What happened? About a month ago, Elena started asking too many questions about where some of the larger deposits were coming from. She was scared that we were getting in over our heads. Marcus, he arranged for her to meet some of his other associates, just to help her understand the importance of discretion. Margaret's blood ran cold. What kind of meeting? They took her to a warehouse down by the waterfront. Nothing happened to her, but they made it very clear. What would happen if she couldn't keep her mouth shut about their business arrangements? They threatened to kill her, not directly, but they showed her some photos of people who had caused problems for their organization in the past, people who had ended up in accidents or disappeared. Margaret felt sick. Her granddaughter, her bright, artistic, beautiful granddaughter, had been terrorized by criminals because of money that ultimately came from Margaret's own bank account. Is that where Elena is now, at the warehouse? Derek nodded miserably. Marcus said she needed to stay somewhere, safe until this situation with you gets resolved. He said it was for her protection, but it doesn't feel like protection. Derek, we need to call the FBI right now. Elena is essentially being held hostage. If we call the FBI, Marcus will know we're cooperating. Derek couldn't finish the sentence. Margaret stood up and moved to the windows, looking down at the city where her granddaughter was being held by criminals. She thought about Elena's terrified phone call, about the fear in her voice, about the 24-year-old girl who was paying the price for a sophisticated fraud scheme she never fully understood. Derek, what does Marcus want from me to let Elena go? He wants you to stop the investigation, fire your lawyers, and go back to transferring money like you did before. He says if you do that, everything goes back to normal and nobody gets hurt. And if I don't? Derek looked at her with tears in his eyes. He says accidents happen to people who cause problems for his business partners. Margaret felt a rage building inside her. That was unlike anything she had ever experienced. Marcus Delano had manipulated her family, stolen her money, terrorized her grandchildren, and was now threatening their lives to protect his criminal operation. But underneath the rage was a cold, calculating fury that came from 40 years of building a business empire alongside her husband. Margaret Jones had not become one of the wealthiest women in the Pacific Northwest by backing down from fights with people who underestimated her. Derek, I want you to call Elena. Tell her to be ready. Ready for what? To leave that warehouse tonight. Derek stared at her. Grandma, what are you planning? Margaret pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found the number she was looking for. I'm planning to end this. You can't just walk in there and demand they release her. These people are dangerous. I'm not walking in there. Margaret found the contact she was looking for and hit call. I'm bringing backup. The phone rang twice before a gruff voice answered. Morrison. Agent Morrison, this is Margaret Jones. I know where my granddaughter is being held, and I know where you can find Marcus Delano's entire operation. Derek grabbed her arm. Grandma, what are you doing? Margaret covered the phone and looked at her grandson with steel in her eyes. I'm saving your sister. And then I'm saving you. And then I'm making sure Marcus Delano never hurts another family the way he's hurt ours. She uncovered the phone. Agent Morrison, how quickly can you get a tactical team to the waterfront? Derek slumped back on the bench, realizing that his grandmother had just declared war on one of the most dangerous criminal organizations in the Pacific Northwest. And somehow, despite everything, he found himself believing she might actually win. The FBI tactical briefing took place in a nondescript office, building 3 blocks from the waterfront warehouse where Elena was being held. Agent Morrison, a compact man in his 50s, with a kind of weathered face that spoke of years spent dealing with dangerous people, spread blueprints and surveillance photos across a metal table. Mrs. Jones, I need you to understand that what we're planning here is extremely dangerous. You don't have to be involved in the operational aspects. Margaret studied the warehouse blueprints with the same intensity she had once brought to analyzing restaurant construction plans with Richard. Agent Morrison, my granddaughter's in that building because I gave her family money that ended up funding a criminal enterprise. I'm not sitting in a safe location while other people clean up my mess. With respect, ma'am, this isn't your mess. Marcus Delano has been running this operation for years. Your family was just one of several fronts he was using. Derek, who had been silent since they arrived at the FBI office, finally spoke up. How many other families are there? Agent Morrison consulted his files. At least 4 that we know of. Wealthy families with internal dysfunction that made them vulnerable to manipulation. Delano's very good at identifying families where money moves freely, but oversight is minimal. Patricia Williams, who had arrived 20 minutes earlier with a team of lawyers, looked up from her legal documents. What kind of charges are we looking at for Margaret's family members? That depends on their level of cooperation and what we find during tonight's operation. If Derek and Elena are willing to testify and provide complete information about the financial network, we can probably work out plea agreements that involve restitution and community service, rather than prison time. What about David? Margaret asked. Agent Morrison's expression grew grimmer. Your son created the shell companies and signed the incorporation documents. Even if he didn't know about the organized crime connections, he's culpable for the basic fraud and money laundering. He's looking at significant federal charges. Margaret felt her heart break a little more. How significant? 5 to 10 years, possibly more, if we can prove he knew about the criminal aspects of the operation. Derek shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Agent Morrison, I don't think my father understood what Marcus was really doing. Dad's not very sophisticated about financial crimes. He just wanted access to money he felt entitled to. That may be true, but ignorance isn't a defense. When it comes to money laundering and wire fraud, your father signed documents creating entities that were used to move him millions of dollars in criminal proceeds. Even if he thought he was just helping his family, he committed federal crimes. Margaret thought about David, about the angry, entitled man who had threatened her just 2 days earlier. Part of her wanted to let him face the full consequences of his choices. But underneath the anger and disappointment, he was still her son. Agent Morrison, if David cooperates fully with your investigation, testifies against Marcus, and agrees to make complete restitution, would that affect his potential sentence? It might. But Mrs. Jones, you need to understand that cooperation means admitting to years of systematic fraud. It means acknowledging that he helped create a criminal enterprise that laundered money for organized crime figures. That's not a small thing. Margaret nodded slowly. I understand. But I also understand that David is 47 years old and has never faced real consequences for his actions. Maybe federal prison is exactly what he needs to become the man his father raised him to be. Derek stared at his grandmother with a mixture of shock and admiration. You're really willing to let Dad go to prison? I'm willing to let your father face the consequences of his choices, just like I'm willing to let you and Elena face yours. Margaret's voice was gentle but firm. The difference is that you and Elena are young, enough to learn from this and build better lives. Your father. I'm not sure he'll ever change unless he's forced to. Agent Morrison checked his watch. We need to move. The tactical team is in position, and we have intelligence suggesting that Delano is planning to relocate Elena tonight. Relocate her where? Derek asked, his voice sharp with fear. We don't know. But based on what we've learned about his operation, when Delano decides someone has become a liability, they tend to disappear permanently. Margaret felt ice water in her veins. How do we get her out? Agent Morrison pointed to the warehouse blueprints. The building has 4 entrances. We'll coordinate simultaneous entry from 3 points, while you and Derek approach from the main entrance. You want us to go in? We want Derek to go in. Marcus Delano has been using your grandson as a go-between, so his presence won't seem unusual. Derek will tell them that you've agreed to stop the investigation, and that Elena can be released. Derek's face went pale. What if they don't believe me? That's where your grandmother comes in. Margaret, you'll be outside the building but visible to anyone watching. Your presence will make Derek's story credible. It will look like you've actually come to negotiate. Margaret studied the blueprints, tracing the layout with her finger. Where will Elena most likely be held? Based on surveillance, we believe she's in the main office area, on the 2nd floor. That's also where we expect to find Delano and his key associates. How many people are we talking about? At least 6, possibly more. And Mrs. Jones, you need to understand that these are dangerous people. They're armed, they're experienced in violence, and they'll fight rather than be taken alive. Margaret thought about Elena, scared and alone in a warehouse full of criminals. She thought about Derek, trembling beside her, at the prospect of walking back into that environment. She thought about the family she had tried so hard to protect through love and money, only to discover that she had been enabling their destruction. Agent Morrison, when do we go? 10 minutes. The drive to the warehouse district took them through parts of Seattle that Margaret rarely visited, industrial areas, where the gleaming tech companies and upscale restaurants give way to shipping containers, freight trains, and the kind of businesses that operated primarily in cash. The warehouse where Elena was being held sat among dozens of similar buildings, unremarkable except for the black SUVs parked outside, and the men who moved with the careful alertness of professional security. Derek sat in the passenger seat of Margaret's Mercedes, his hands shaking as they approached the building. Grandma, I'm scared. I'm scared too, Margaret admitted. But Derek, your sister needs us. And after tonight, this all ends. What if something goes wrong? What if they figure out this is a setup? Margaret pulled into the parking area across from the warehouse, where Agent Morrison had instructed her to position herself. From here, she would be visible to anyone watching from the building, but far enough away to be safe when the tactical team moved in. Derek, look at me. Her grandson turned to face her, and Margaret saw the frightened little boy, who used to run to her for comfort after bad dreams. Your grandfather built Jones Industries from nothing through honest work and principled decisions. He never backed down from a fight when he knew he was right, and he never abandoned family when they needed help. Tonight, we're going to honor his memory by saving Elena and ending this criminal operation. Derek nodded, his jaw setting with determination that reminded Margaret powerfully of Richard. What do I tell them? Tell them I've agreed to stop the investigation and return to the old financial arrangements. Tell them I just want Elena back safely and for all of this to be over. And if they want to speak to you directly, then you tell them I'm too emotional to negotiate face-to-face, but that I'm here to show good faith. Derek took a deep breath and opened the car door. Grandma, if something happens to me, nothing is going to happen to you. The FBI is watching, I'm watching, and in 5 minutes this will all be over. Margaret watched her grandson walk across the parking area, toward the warehouse entrance. He moved with the casual confidence of someone who belonged there, but she could see the tension in his shoulders and the slight tremor in his hands. The warehouse door opened before Derek reached it, and two men emerged. Even from a distance, Margaret could tell they were dangerous. They moved with the kind of predatory awareness that came from years of violence. One of them spoke to Derek, gesturing toward Margaret's car. Derek responded with animated gestures that she hoped conveyed the right mixture of family drama and financial negotiation. Her phone buzzed with a text from Agent Morrison. Teams in position. Keep Derek talking for 2 more minutes. Margaret watched as Derek disappeared into the building with one of the men, while the other remained outside, openly watching her car. She felt exposed and vulnerable, but also strangely calm. For the first time in years, she knew exactly what she was doing and why she was doing it. Another text from Agent Morrison. 1 minute. Be ready to duck. Margaret gripped the steering wheel and tried to project the image of a wealthy grandmother who had been beaten into submission by criminals and was now ready to negotiate for her granddaughter's life. It wasn't entirely acting. She was genuinely terrified for Derek and Elena, but underneath the fear was a cold determination that would have made Richard proud. The tactical operation began with an explosion of coordinated movement that was both chaotic and precisely orchestrated. Black-clad FBI agents poured from concealed positions around the warehouse, moving toward the building from 3 directions simultaneously. The man watching Margaret's car spun toward the sound of approaching footsteps and reached for something under his jacket, but he was on the ground with his hands zip-tied behind his back before he could complete the motion. Margaret watched in fascination as the agents moved, with the kind of professional competence that came from years of training and experience. Within seconds, they had secured the perimeter and were entering the building through multiple access points. Her phone rang. Agent Morrison. Mrs. Jones, stay in your car until we give you the all clear. We're inside the building now. Margaret could hear shouting in the background, along with the sound of doors being kicked in, and orders being barked in the kind of authoritative voices that brooked no argument. Derek and Elena? We're looking for them now. Stand by. The next 10 minutes felt like hours. Margaret watched agents moving in and out of the building, escorting handcuffed suspects to waiting vehicles. She saw boxes of documents being loaded into FBI trucks, along with computer equipment and what appeared to be large amounts of cash. Finally, the warehouse door opened and Derek emerged, flanked by 2 FBI agents. Even from a distance, Margaret could see that he was unharmed but shaken. Behind him came Elena, supported by a female agent, and moving under her own power. Margaret was out of her car and running toward her grandchildren before she consciously decided to move. Elena saw her coming and broke away from the agent, throwing herself into Margaret's arms with a sob of relief. Grandma, I was so scared. I thought they were going to kill me. Margaret held her granddaughter tightly, feeling the trembling in Elena's small frame and the dampness of tears against her shoulder. You're safe now. It's over. Derek joined them, and for a moment, the 3 generations of Jones women stood together in the parking lot of a warehouse, where federal agents were dismantling a criminal empire that had nearly destroyed their family. Agent Morrison approached them with a satisfied expression. We got them all. Marcus Delano, 6 associates, and enough evidence to put them away for decades. We also recovered over $3 million in cash and cryptocurrency, along with financial records that will help us identify and prosecute their clients. What about my father? Derek asked quietly. Agent Morrison's expression grew more serious. David was arrested at his home 20 minutes ago. He's being processed at the federal building downtown. Elena looked up from Margaret's shoulder. What's going to happen to us? That depends on how willing you are to cooperate with our investigation. We'll need complete statements about your involvement, testimony about the people you met and the activities you witnessed, and full disclosure of every account and transaction you were involved in. Derek nodded. We'll tell you everything. We just want this to be over. Agent Morrison handed Margaret a business card. Mrs. Jones, we'll need to interview you as well, but that can wait until tomorrow. Tonight, I suggest you take your grandchildren home and try to process what's happened. As they drove back toward downtown Seattle, Margaret's phone rang constantly with calls from reporters who had somehow gotten word of the FBI operation. Patricia Williams called to say that the legal ramifications would take months to sort out, but that Derek and Elena would almost certainly avoid prison time in exchange for their cooperation. What about Dad? Elena asked from the back seat. Margaret thought about her son sitting in a federal holding cell and finally facing the consequences of a lifetime of poor choices. Your father will have to answer for what he's done. But Elena, prison might be the best thing that could happen to him. He's never learned to take responsibility for his actions. Will you visit him? Derek asked. Yes, and I'll make sure he has good legal representation. But I won't bail him out this time. Some lessons can only be learned the hard way. They drove in silence for several miles, each lost in their own thoughts about how dramatically their lives had changed over the past few days. Grandma, Elena said finally, I know this doesn't fix anything, but I want you to know that Derek and I really are sorry, not just about getting caught, but about lying to you for so long, about taking advantage of your love. Margaret met her granddaughter's eyes in the rearview mirror. Elena, I'm sorry too. I'm sorry I gave you money instead of teaching you to earn it. I'm sorry I solved your problems instead of helping you learn to solve them yourselves. And I'm sorry it took a federal criminal investigation for me to realize that I was enabling your poor choices instead of loving you properly. What happens now? Derek asked. Margaret thought about the question as they approached her downtown penthouse. What did happen now? Her family was essentially destroyed. David facing federal prison, Lydia likely to be financially ruined, Derek and Elena facing years of legal proceedings and the challenge of building lives based on honest work rather than family money. But underneath the wreckage, Margaret sensed an opportunity for something better. For the first time in years, everyone in her family would be forced to face reality. Derek and Elena would have to learn to support themselves. David would have to confront the consequences of his entitlement and dishonesty. And Margaret herself would have to figure out how to be a grandmother and family patriarch without being an ATM. Now we rebuild, she said as they pulled into the parking garage. All of us. Based on honesty this time. And real love instead of financial dependence. Even Dad, especially your father, prison might be exactly what David needs to remember. Who he was before he became obsessed with money he didn't earn. As they rode the elevator up to the penthouse, Margaret realized that for the first time in years, she felt genuinely hopeful about her family's future. Not because the problems were solved, they were just beginning, but because the lies were finally over. The truth was ugly and painful, and would probably destroy the comfortable illusions they had all been living with for years. But the truth was also the foundation on which real relationships could be built. Richard would have understood that. He had always known that love without truth was just enabling, and that the kindest thing you could sometimes do for people was to stop, rescuing them from the consequences of their choices. Margaret Jones was finally ready to love her family, the way Richard would have wanted her to, with wisdom, with boundaries, and with the kind of tough compassion that helps people become their best selves, rather than their most comfortable ones. The hardest part was over. Now came the real work of rebuilding their lives, on a foundation of truth instead of money. And for the first time in years, Margaret was looking forward to the challenge. Epilogue, 18 months later. Margaret Jones stood in the kitchen of her penthouse, preparing Sunday dinner for what had become a cherished weekly tradition. The meal was simpler than the elaborate spreads she used to host homemade pasta, fresh vegetables from the farmer's market, and wine that cost less per bottle than she used to spend on single meals at expensive restaurants. But the conversations around her dining table had never been richer or more honest. Derek arrived first, as he had every Sunday for the past 6 months. At 26, he looked older than his years, but in a good way. The soft edges of privilege had been replaced by the lean confidence of someone who worked for his living. He wore scrubs from the hospital, where he worked as a patient care technician while studying for his MCAT exams. Grandma, Doctor Martinez says my practice test scores are high enough to get into medical school for real this time, he said, kissing her cheek as he helped set the table. How does it feel to earn it honestly? Margaret asked. Derek paused in his work, considering the question seriously. Terrifying, but also satisfying in a way I didn't expect. When I actually pass the MCAT, when I actually get accepted, I'll know it's because I worked for it. Elena arrived 20 minutes later, paint still under her fingernails from the Community Arts Center, where she taught children's classes 3 days a week. She was taking night courses in education and had discovered that she loved teaching more than creating art herself. How are the kids today? Margaret asked. Exhausting and wonderful, Elena replied, pulling her grandmother into a hug that lasted longer than usual. Mrs. Rodriguez's 8-year-old painted a portrait of her grandmother that made me cry. It reminded me of all those pictures I used to paint for your refrigerator. I still have them, Margaret said quietly. All of them. The three of them worked together to finish preparing dinner, moving around each other with the easy familiarity of people who had learned to find joy in simple, honest moments together. "Any word from Dad?" Derek asked as they sat down to eat. Margaret nodded. "He called yesterday. The prison job training program is going well, and he's been accepted into their small business management course." David had pled guilty to federal fraud and money laundering charges and received a sentence of 4 years with the possibility of parole in 2.5. The man who had once felt entitled to millions of dollars was now learning to manage a prison commissary for $12 a week. "Does he seem different?" Elena asked. "He seems humbled," Margaret replied carefully. "Whether that translates into genuine change remains to be seen, but the letters I get from him now are very different from the person who used to demand money from me." Margaret had visited David once a month since his incarceration, bringing him books and news of the family, but no promises of financial support upon his release. The first few visits had been difficult. David had been angry, bitter, and convinced that he was the victim of an overzealous prosecution. But gradually the forced structure of prison life and the reality of living without access to family money had begun to change him. His most recent letter had included something Margaret had never received from her son before: a genuine apology. "What about Mom?" Derek asked. Lydia's fate had been perhaps the most poetic justice of all. With David in prison and the family money cut off, she had been forced to sell the luxury apartment, the expensive cars, and most of her designer wardrobe to pay basic living expenses. She now worked as a sales associate at a high-end boutique and lived in a modest apartment that she paid for with her own earnings. "Your mother is adjusting," Margaret said diplomatically. "She called to ask if she could join us for dinner next week." Elena's eyebrows shot up. "Really? After everything that's happened? Your mother never knew about the criminal aspects of what your father was doing. She was willfully ignorant about money, but she wasn't malicious. I think she's finally learning to distinguish between wants and needs." The conversation continued through dinner, touching on Derek's medical school applications, Elena's teaching certification program, and Margaret's own recent decision to establish a scholarship fund for first-generation college students who wanted to study business ethics. "I've been thinking about your grandfather a lot lately," Margaret said as they cleaned up after dinner. "About what he would think of how things turned out." "Do you think he would approve?" Derek asked. Margaret considered the question while loading dishes into the dishwasher, a task she had never done before. Her household staff was let go as part of her post-crisis financial restructuring. "I think he would be proud that we finally learned to tell the difference between love and money," she said. "And I think he would be amazed that it took a federal criminal investigation to teach us that lesson." Elena laughed, the first genuinely happy sound Margaret had heard from her granddaughter in years. "Grandma, do you ever regret it? Cutting off the money, exposing everything, letting Dad go to prison?" Margaret thought about the question as she wiped down the counters. Did she regret destroying the comfortable illusions that had defined her family for so many years? "I regret that it took me so long to realize what I was doing wrong," she said finally. "I regret enabling all of you instead of loving you properly. But no, I don't regret stopping. You two are becoming the people I always hoped you would be, and that never would have happened if I had continued to solve all your problems with money. Even if it meant Dad going to prison, especially because it meant your father going to prison. Derek, your father is 49 years old and has never faced consequences for his actions. Prison might be the best thing that's ever happened to him." As Derek and Elena prepared to leave, Margaret handed each of them an envelope. "What's this?" Elena asked. "Your monthly allowances," Margaret said with a slight smile. Derek opened his envelope and found a check for exactly $100, along with a handwritten note for groceries and gas. "Love, Grandma." $100? Derek stared at the check. "Grandma, my rent alone is $800 a month. Then I suggest you keep working and studying hard." Margaret replied cheerfully, $100 is what you get because I love you. Everything else is what you get because you earn it." Elena hugged her grandmother tightly. "You know we love you more now than we ever did when you were giving us thousands of dollars every month, right?" Margaret felt tears threatening, happy tears this time. "I was hoping you might say that." After her grandchildren left, Margaret stood in her penthouse, looking out at the Seattle skyline. The apartment felt different now, smaller somehow, but warmer. The expensive art was still on the walls, and the designer furniture still filled the rooms. But the space no longer felt like a museum of wealth. It felt like a home where real people lived honest lives. Her phone rang, and Margaret smiled when she saw Patricia Williams' name on the caller ID. Margaret, how was dinner with the kids? Perfect. Derek is applying to medical school for real this time. And Elena is discovering that she loves teaching more than she ever loved creating art. And how are you holding up with the new financial reality? Margaret looked around the penthouse that now cost her a fraction of what it used to cost to maintain, since she was no longer supporting her entire extended family's expensive lifestyles. Patricia, I've discovered something interesting. It turns out that when you stop giving away hundreds of thousands of dollars every year to people who don't appreciate it, you actually end up feeling wealthier, not poorer. The kids are working, both of them. Derek works at the hospital and Elena teaches art classes. They split a modest apartment, cook their own meals and budget carefully for everything from groceries to entertainment, and they seem happier than they've ever been. What about David's release? Margaret was quiet for a moment. David would be eligible for parole in another year, and she had been thinking about what kind of relationship, if any, they might have when he got out. I think when David is released, he'll be a different person than the one who went in. Whether that person and I can rebuild a relationship remains to be seen. And if he reverts to his old patterns, then he'll discover that the bank of Margaret Jones is permanently closed for business. But Patricia, I have hope. For the first time in years, I have genuine hope about my family's future. After Patricia hung up, Margaret made herself a cup of tea and settled into Richard's old chair with a book. Outside her windows, the city lights twinkled like earthbound stars. And somewhere out, there were families working for their daily bread, telling each other the truth and learning the difference between love and money. Margaret thought about the champagne glass that had shattered on her kitchen floor 18 months ago, the moment when her old life ended and her new one began. She had spent 2 days thinking that her family was falling apart, only to realize that they were finally falling together. The truth had been ugly and painful, and it cost them everything they thought they valued. But the truth had also set them free to become the people they were meant to be, instead of the people money had made them. Richard would have understood. He had always known that the most valuable things in life couldn't be bought, stolen, or inherited. They had to be earned through honest work, maintained through genuine love, and protected through the kind of difficult choices that required courage more than money. Margaret Jones closed her book, turned off the lights, and went to bed, in a penthouse that finally felt like home. Tomorrow she would visit David in prison, not to rescue him, but to remind him that no matter what he had done, he was still her son and she still loved him. But tonight, she would sleep peacefully for the first time in years, knowing that her family was finally learning the difference between being supported and being spoiled, between being loved and being bought, between having everything handed to you and earning what truly mattered, the hardest lesson they had ever learned, and the most valuable.